In this video we want to talk about some issues in production planning. Now, all manufacturing and service operations require planning. They also require controlling. Although the formality and detail may vary between the two, the balance between the two needs to be considered according to the activities of the organization. Some organizations wish to have very detailed plans. Others rely on controlling the organization almost on a day-to-day basis. They like to have flexibility in the running of the business. But to some extent, all businesses do need a plan. They need to have a roadmap. They need to know where they're going or what they're aiming at, what they're trying to achieve. And the business does need to be controlled. It needs to have some sort of organization, and there should be a chain of command, some sort of organizational structure which enables the management to control the business and indeed point the business towards the achievement of the plans that were set out. So it may vary from company to company and from business to business, but essentially these two components are required for all businesses. They really do need to have a direction in which they're moving, in which they want to move. That's their plan, and they need to control the business and make sure that it's running so as to achieve what they've set out. Some operations are more difficult to plan than others. Those with high unpredictability can be difficult to plan, for example. It's very difficult for the management to predict demand for the product, and therefore they have to plan contingencies. What if demand slumps in the next quarter? What if demand peaks in the next quarter? Do we have the capacity to meet that surge in demand? Or if demand falls off, what will we do with the existing workforce? How will we restructure the organization? How will we redeploy the resources within the organization to minimize the impact of the downturn in sales? Businesses essentially are looking into the future, and the future can't be predicted. There are too many variables in play. There's the government, local government, communities, the customers, the markets, the competitors. There are so many issues to be taken into account, and all of them tend to change over time. So it's very difficult for a business to factor all of those in. Now let's look at production planning. Well, the day-to-day running of manufacturing and service system rests on production planning. There is a need to ensure that when an order is received, let's say in a production company, when an order is received, that it is processed and it's put into the system in an orderly fashion, one that sequences it correctly and brings the proper set of resources to bear on manufacturing or producing or delivering the requirements of that order. The purpose of the production planning is to ensure that manufacturing runs effectively and efficiently and produces products as required by customers. So production planning is really aimed at the satisfaction that the customers get in receiving the product. The product should be good quality and delivered on time. It should have the right attributes, the right qualities that the customers want. So the plan is to achieve that, and then the constraints that the production planners are facing are the resources of the business, the number of machines and skilled personnel and the competencies and abilities of the personnel to produce high quality output that meets customer requirements. But these are essential if the business is to succeed in the long run. Now, production planning activities. Well, in the long term, difficult to know what the long term is, but in years, perhaps 5 years, 10 years, there is an issue that the business needs to plan capacity. It needs to know what facility is required, what floor space, what's required in the long run, and what equipment is required, and how do they go about the procurement of that equipment. So in the long run, there is an issue about ensuring that the business will be in existence in the long run. It'll have the right size, it'll have the right equipment, it'll be configured so as to meet the challenges of the long run. Now, this is notoriously difficult to do because we live in a world that's globalized. Many companies may outsource to companies elsewhere. So it's very difficult for production planners to really have a fix on what's going to happen in the long term. Having said that, they must have it on the agenda. They must try to do it. They must look into it to see if it is possible, if it is feasible to plan on that scale or on that time level. In the intermediate term, difficult to say what that is as well, but typically about 18 months. There's aggregate planning, looking at whatever the current set of capital is. What are the current floor space, machinery, stores capacity, competencies of the workforce, the number of the workforce. Looking at this and seeing how it can be fully utilized, how it can be optimized. But also looking at personnel needs to make sure that they have the right skills and they're properly motivated and rewarded for their efforts. And also there may be an issue about subcontracting, which is very similar to outsourcing I mentioned earlier. In this case, perhaps doing some sort of, or arranging some sort of contract with other companies to supply perhaps components which are built in to the product itself. And that's common in many industries. In the car industry, a lot of the electronics and indeed many of the parts that go into cars are outsourced. They're subcontractors. There are producers all over the world who make harnesses for electric windows and mirrors and so on. And these are bought in. So there's aggregate planning of that nature that needs to be conducted. And then there's the master production schedule in the short term. Now, this could be just stretching into weeks. The material requirements plan. What numbers of are they talking about? What materials are required? What's the plan for the use of those materials? When can the materials be bought and where will they go and how should they be machined or changed or dealt with? There has to be some plan governing what's coming into the business and trying to convert it into the output that's required by the customer. But the master production plan is really a disaggregation of the master plan. The master plan covers everything. That's why it's called the master's plan. It looks at production, marketing, the administration, the entire capacity of the business. The production plan takes out of that. It takes itself out so that it knows what it needs to do. And the parameters within which the production plan is implemented and run are set out in the master plan. That's the master plan for the business. So the production personnel must try to achieve what's been set out in the master plan. And in the very short term, could be just a matter of days, it's just looking at the workload of the various operators to see that it is both safe and achievable, and trying to make sure that sequences are developed which are rational, make sense and are efficient. Sequences in terms of who does what, which job comes before which job, and how the material is moved around the plant from one machine to the next, or from one operator to the next. The sequence should be logical, and it should lead to a continuous flow of production which will go towards minimizing costs. So production planning is of that format. The very long run, difficult to predict, but nonetheless the production planners have to try, use their best guesses, and look at what's been said in the press and in the literature about what's likely to be on the business agenda in years to come. Then looking at the aggregate planning in the intermediate term, perhaps over the next year or two, looking at how the facility is utilized, see where there's spare capacity, where there's wastage, where the capacity is overworked or overstretched, looking at personnel needs, subcontracting, as I said earlier. And the master production schedule is looking at the materials, looking at the resources, and trying to pick out of these what is required to meet what has been mentioned in the master plan for the business in terms of the direction that the management want the business to move in, and in the very short term making sure that there is a rational and logical sequence of production events that leads to cost minimization and efficiencies on the shop floor. Now, production planning, well, units of measurement. The long range capacity planning, well, the entire product line. So that could be the unit of measurement, the entire product line, looking at the product, looking at the line from start to finish, from raw materials and components through assembly and manufacturing and processing, all the way up to packaging and distribution. It depends on how you define the line and where it starts and where it ends. It could be it starts with raw materials coming in to the business and ends in the final product. But look at the capacity, the long run capacity of the business. What can they produce in terms of numbers? And will that capacity meet customer requirements? Will there be a shortfall? And if there is, what's the plan to fix that, to remove the shortfall? So it's looking at the entire product line from start to finish. And there's aggregate planning, looking at the product family, looking at not just one particular product, but looking at different products that are produced within the business, and trying to plan for the various products taken in total, that there are different products going through the system perhaps at the same time, seeing how they are sequenced and how they are being processed, and if there is some improvement that can be made to that sequence. The master production scheduling, well, that's looking at specific product models. So it's looking at the existing product range, then selecting the individual products and looking at the model that's being used to produce that, and then trying to develop a plan for each product, and then ensuring that the summation of all of those individual plans meets the master production schedule, or can fit into a master production schedule, so that there is control within the business. There's not just planning, but now there is control. The master production schedule should sequence the jobs going through, looking at individual products that are being produced, and ensuring that the sequence is logical, it fits the capacity of the business, that the work moves from one phase to the next in a logical manner, and which will lead to efficiencies. But the master production schedule will then control the business, will control the production part of the business, I should say. Production planning and control systems. Well, looking at labour, materials and machines, it's important to have a good understanding of the capacity of labour, of the materials and of the machines to ensure that the business can work within its capacity and that it can meet customer requirements with that capacity. So it may mean sometimes cutting back on one particular product and putting all of the resources into another area because there is a pressing need for that product to be produced and delivered soon. So there should be flexibility within the production system so that resources are able to be taken away from one activity and seamlessly fit into a different activity so as to increase the throughput of that activity to meet customer requirements. And then, when it's met, that those resources are able to go back and pick up where they were and continue with that line of production. So there should be flexibility within the planning system. And it's all controlled, as I said, by the master production schedule. But the control is such that the management are able to switch resources if the need arises from one line of activity to another so as to meet the customer deadline or the customer requirements. Now the planning strategies, well, capacity options would be to change capacity, perhaps look at the existing capacity of the business, how many units can it produce in a month or in a week, and then try to change the capacity. That may be by expanding the capacity or indeed tailing it back, cutting back on the capacity. Maybe there's too much capacity in the business and it's wasteful. But changing the capacity, there should be some strategy for adjusting the capacity to meet market requirements. That's assuming, of course, that the management have a good idea of what the market will be next year and deep into the future. And of course, that's very tricky to say. So cutting back on capacity may be a dangerous strategy, but nonetheless one that should be looked at. There is an issue about changing inventory levels as well. Not just looking at the capacity of the business in terms of production, but look at the capacity of the business to meet customer orders, to meet customer requirements. And it's not just scaling up production or toning it back. It may be having inventory levels that in quiet times production was aimed at building up inventory levels in the stores, and inventory can then be taken out and used to meet peak demands. So if there's a surge in customer demand for the product, it can be met out of inventories perhaps. But that needs to be worked out. What is the ideal level of inventory? There may also be a discussion about varying the workforce, varying the size of the workforce, and with additional staff hired at times of peak demand and perhaps layoffs in times of slump in demand. It's very difficult to just take on extra workers and lay off extra workers. There are costs associated for a start. That's ignoring the fact that these are human beings who are just taken on and let go. But there are costs to the business, so we can just stick with the commercial issues for a moment. Hiring staff, the staff have to be inducted into the business methods, inducted into health and safety and all of the issues associated with working in the business. They then have to be trained to have particular skills, and then they have to be put in place and monitored and supported whilst they learn by doing. In terms of layoffs, redundancy payments may have to be made, and that's expensive. So companies are reticent to just vary the workforce. It's generally speaking not an option that companies go for. They try to stick with their existing workforce as much as they can. That's the best strategy. Varying production capacity through overtime or idle time. It is a strategy, just if there's too much demand, if there's a lot of demand, then trying to step up production through overtime working. It may be possible, but sometimes workers don't want to work extra. They're tired after a long day and they don't want to spend an extra few hours, or they may have family commitments. Also, idle time. If there's a fall in demand, customer demand for the product, there may be too much capacity in the business, and so the business might have to go on a 3-day a week or a 4-day a week or whatever it is. And that's resented by the workforce, whose remuneration may be reduced. It creates bad feelings and a loss of morale amongst the workforce. But nonetheless, sometimes it's the only strategy. Subcontracting is one that has always been really quite popular. Rather than produce everything in-house, which may mean that certain components, only a small amount are needed, and it would take highly specialist machines and specialist staff to produce those items, it's far better to just buy them in. So subcontracting isn't always an option. And in a time when we have outsourcing, it could be even that whole parts of the production system are outsourced to other companies. So they take responsibility for producing the item. Using part-time workers is an option, and some people appreciate having part-time work as opposed to full-time work. Again, perhaps for family reasons or health reasons or whatever it is. But part-time workers can't really be used as a supply valve, turning it on and off. They need some sort of security as well in their employment. They still have bills to pay and obligations, perhaps towards family, or they still have to pay their utility bills and so on. So part-time workers can't really be used as a supply valve. But they do introduce an element of flexibility for the business. At least some form of flexibility. Now, demand options, well, change demand, but changing demand is very difficult. The company can try to influence demand through marketing campaigns and advertising and promotions and contact with customers, but it's still difficult to influence customers who perhaps don't particularly want to buy more of the product. They have enough. So increasing demand may be difficult, and it's unlikely the company would want to reduce its own demand or its own position in the marketplace. Back ordering during high demand periods. Sometimes customers place orders during high demand periods, and it's trying to meet those in a timely fashion, trying to meet them so that they get to the customer in a reasonable time. So even if they can't be met immediately when the orders are placed, trying to meet them as fast as possible and get them to the customer. Counter-seasonal product mixing. Counter-seasonal means sometimes producing the product in the off-season. For example, Christmas cards may be produced in June. They won't be used until December, but companies who produce them will be producing all sorts of cards, perhaps birthday cards and all sorts of greetings cards and family cards. They'll also produce perhaps Christmas cards, but so as to even out their production, they might produce the Christmas cards over a long period, perhaps even over the whole year. They may be producing Christmas cards on a continuous basis, just to keep the company running, particularly trying to even out peaks and troughs in customer demand for other cards within the business. So if the demand for birthday cards falls, they may increase their production of Christmas cards, because they know when Christmas comes there will be a demand for those. So counter-seasonal product mixing means looking at the demand for products, and if demand is rising, then it may mean switching off one line of production and turning the resources over to meeting that particular demand. But when that demand falls off, then switching back to something which is counter-seasonal, in the sense that in the middle of the summer they may be producing Christmas cards. That's just an example, but it illustrates the point. So that's production strategies and planning, and that's all we're going to deal with in this video. So let's leave it at that and say thank you for watching.